In 1987, a journalist asked Freddie Mercury a question that nobody had quite asked him before. Not about the music, not about Queen, not about the next album or the last tour, or what he thought of his contemporaries. About him, whether looking at his life as it was and as it had been, he had any regrets. Freddie Mercury answered. He took the question seriously. He thought about it visibly in the way he thought about things that mattered to him, with a quality of attention that people who interviewed him recognized as a sign that they had reached something real. And then he answered, fully, honestly, with the specific directness of someone who has nothing to hide and nothing to protect, and who understands that the question deserves an answer that is actually true. That interview given to the journalist David Wigg in 1987 is the last time Freddie Mercury spoke freely about his private life and his private self in a sustained public way. Within months of its completion, everything changed. The diagnosis had arrived. The decision to conceal it had been made. And the version of Freddie Mercury who could sit in a room with a journalist and answer a question about regrets with genuine honesty disappeared. He did not disappear gradually. He disappeared at a specific moment in a specific year. This is the story of what he said before that moment, and of why it was the last time. David Wigg was not a confrontational interviewer. He was not the kind of journalist who arrived with an agenda or who used the interview as an opportunity to produce revelations that the subject would regret. He was a music journalist of long standing. He had interviewed the Beatles individually and collectively across the late 1960s and early 1970s, had built relationships with the major figures of British rock across 2 decades, and was known among the people he interviewed as someone who could be trusted with the things they actually wanted to say. Freddie Mercury had spoken to him before. The relationship had a quality of established mutual respect that made genuine conversation possible in a way that it was not always possible with journalists who were strangers. When Wigg asked the regrets question in 1987, he was asking it in the context of a longer conversation about Freddie Mercury's life and career, not as a gotcha, not as an intrusion, but as the natural deepening of a conversation between two people who had known each other for a while and who were talking about something real. To understand what Freddie Mercury was carrying in 1987, you have to understand what 1987 was. The diagnosis had arrived in October of that year, the private meeting in Montreux. The 4 members of Queen in a room, Freddie telling the band what a doctor had told him. The decision to conceal the diagnosis from the public and from almost everyone outside the immediate inner circle was made almost simultaneously with the receipt of the diagnosis itself. It was not a delayed decision. It was not something Freddie agonized over for weeks. He decided quickly and apparently without significant internal conflict that the public world would not know. His mother would not know for years. The press would not know until the day before he died. The management of the information became, from October 1987 onward, one of the primary facts of his daily existence. It required a specific kind of alertness, a constant monitoring of what was being communicated and what was not. The David Wigg interview, the conversation about regrets, the honest, sustained engagement with a journalist's questions about his private life took place in this same year. Whether it happened before or after the diagnosis is a question the historical record does not answer with complete certainty. The interview's quality suggests before. The fact of its being the last of its kind suggests that the decision, whenever it came, closed the door. Think about what a regret is. Not a failure. Not something you did wrong. A regret is something you would do differently. It is the specific acknowledgement that the life you have had and the choices you have made are not the only life you could have had and not the only choices you could have made. Freddie Mercury in 1987 sat with David Wigg and answered the question honestly. What he said tells you more about the private Freddie Mercury than almost any other thing he ever said in public. What Freddie Mercury said about regrets in the David Wigg interview was not what the public expected him to say. He did not talk about career decisions. He did not say he regretted not making more albums or touring differently or collaborating with people he had not collaborated with. He talked about his private life, about the specific quality of the loneliness that fame had produced, not the performed loneliness of celebrity complaint, but the specific and located experience of being very famous and understanding, from the inside, what fame does to the possibility of ordinary human connection. He talked about love, Not any specific relationship, but love as a category of experience. The difficulty of finding it and keeping it and trusting it in the specific conditions that his life had created. He said he was not sure he had always known how to let people love him. He said it with a directness and a lack of self-pity that transformed what might, in another mouth, have been self-indulgent confession into something that felt more like honest accounting. A man looking at his life clearly and naming what he found. The loneliness that Freddie Mercury described to David Wigg was not the loneliness of isolation. He was surrounded in 1987 by people who genuinely cared about him. Jim Hutton was in his life. Peter Freestone was his constant practical companion. The inner circle of Garden Lodge was warm and functional and real. The loneliness he was describing was something more structural than that. It was the specific loneliness of a person who has, in the act of constructing a public persona of extraordinary power and completeness, placed that persona between themselves and the world in a way that makes ordinary human contact difficult. People did not see Freddie Mercury. They saw Freddie Mercury, the performance, the icon, the voice, and the gap between what they saw and who he actually was, the gap that the persona both created and maintained, was a form of loneliness that had nothing to do with how many people were in the room. He had always been private. The fame had made the privacy into something more complicated than a preference. It had made it into a condition. And in the Wigg interview, for one of the last times, he named the condition honestly. He said he was not sure he had always known how to let people love him. That sentence, sit with it for a moment. The most loved performer of his generation, describing the difficulty of being loved, not the difficulty of loving, the difficulty of receiving it. That is the sentence at the center of this interview. That is what he never said again. October 1987. Private meeting, Mountain Studios, Montreux. The diagnosis. And within a very short time, the account suggests days rather than weeks, the specific shape of Freddie Mercury's public self underwent a change that was total and immediate. Not in the music. The music continued to be honest, continued to deepen, continued to carry more weight the closer the end came. But in the public conversation, in the interviews, in the press engagements, in the public statements, something closed. He stopped answering personal questions in the way he had answered them before. He developed quickly and with the specific efficiency of a very intelligent person managing a very serious problem, a set of responses to personal questions that were warm and engaging and told the interviewer nothing they had not already known. He became, in the public sphere, more charming and less present simultaneously. The charm was real. Freddie Mercury was always genuinely charming. It was not a performance, but it became the thing behind which the presence lived, rather than the thing through which the presence expressed itself. The door closed. The warmth remained in the doorway. The room it had come from was no longer accessible. The concealment of the diagnosis across the 4 years from 1987 to 1991 was managed with a discipline that the people who were inside it have described as remarkable. Not because concealment itself is remarkable, many people keep health information private, and Freddie Mercury's reasons for doing so were clear and legitimate and entirely his own business. But because the specific conditions under which the concealment had to be maintained were extraordinarily demanding. He was a public figure of global visibility, surrounded by an industry full of people whose professional interest involved knowing things about him, in a period, the late 1980s, when AIDS was the most publicly discussed health crisis of the era. Every interview, every public appearance, every interaction with the industry required a level of management and control that operated continuously and invisibly. The version of him that appeared in public from 1987 onward was entirely real. His warmth, his humor, his professionalism, his care for the people around him were all genuine. But it was edited in a specific way. The editing had a purpose. In the David Wigg interview, which predated or immediately preceded the decision, was the last record of the unedited version. The David Wigg interview of 1987 is one of the most significant documents in the public record of Freddie Mercury's inner life. Not because it contains shocking revelations, it does not. Not because it is the only honest thing he ever said, it is not. But because of where it sits in the chronology. It is the record of what Freddie Mercury was willing to say about himself in public at the last moment when he was willing to say it. Everything before it is the accumulated record of a man building a career and a persona and figuring out, across 2 decades of fame, what he wanted the public to know about him. Everything after it is the record of a man managing a private reality that required the public version of himself to be carefully maintained. The Wigg interview sits at the seam between those two periods. It has the specific quality of a last conversation before something changes, the particular openness that sometimes comes when a person senses, consciously or not, that the territory they are standing in is about to become unavailable. There is a specific quality to the last honest thing a person says before they decide to stop being honest. It tends to be the most honest thing they have ever said, because the decision to stop hasn't been made yet. The guard isn't up. The editing hasn't started. Freddie Mercury answered David Wigg's question about regrets before the guard went up. That is what makes the answer worth knowing. The interviews Freddie Mercury gave after 1987 were not dishonest. They were not performances of a false self. They were something more specific. They were carefully bounded. He was warm and funny and engaging. He talked about the music with genuine enthusiasm. He was good company for journalists who came to interview him and who left with usable, quotable material and a sense that they had spent time with someone genuinely worth knowing. But the personal questions, the questions that reached toward the private self, toward what he actually felt about his life and what he actually wanted and what he actually regretted, those questions met, from 1987 onward, a different kind of answer than the answer David Wigg had received. Not a cold answer, not an evasive answer, an answer that was warm and complete and that disclosed nothing. The craft of the new response was extraordinary. You could not see the editing. You could only see, if you were paying close attention and if you had heard the earlier interviews, that something that had been available before was no longer available. Brian May has spoken about Freddie Mercury's privacy in the years after the diagnosis with a consistent quality of understanding and restraint that suggests a man who has thought carefully about what is and is not his to say. He has described Freddie's management of the concealment as something they all respected, not because they were asked to, but because they understood why it existed, and because the understanding of why it existed made respecting it the natural thing to do. He has also described, in careful fragments across various interviews, a specific quality of Freddie's public self in those final years that converges with what the interviewer record shows, that something had closed, that the Freddie who appeared in public was real, genuinely and completely real, but was operating within a set of limits that had not been there before. Brian May has used the word managed when describing Freddie's public persona in those years. Not pejoratively, accurately, it was managed, with precision and with care. And what was being managed was the space between what the public world was allowed to know and what was actually happening. David Wigg asked the question, Freddie answered it. The tape ran, the interview was published, and then the door closed and no journalist ever received that answer again. Not because Freddie Mercury became dishonest, because he became careful. And the careful version is what most of the world knows. The honest version is this interview. The regrets Freddie Mercury named to David Wigg in 1987 were not grand or dramatic. They were the specific, private, human regrets of a man who had lived intensely and publicly and who understood, at 40 years old, what the living had cost in the private currency of ordinary connection. He was not sure he had always known how to let people love him. He had chosen the performance, again and again, over the disclosure. He had built something extraordinary from that choice music that has outlasted everything, a public presence that remains one of the most vivid in the history of popular culture. And he had paid for it in the specific way that people who choose the performance over the disclosure pay for it, in the accumulation of moments when the private self was not seen, not reached, not quite known by the people who thought they knew him. He said this honestly to David Wigg in 1987. He said it once. And then October arrived, and the diagnosis arrived, and the guard went up, and the honest version went somewhere private and stayed there. What you are hearing now is the tape from before the door closed. This is the last time Freddie Mercury spoke freely. This is what he said.